Charlie received his Ph.D. under the direction of Peter Osorio in clinical psychology from the University of Colorado. Trained as a child clinical psychologist, he practiced as a play and family therapist at the Rochester Mental Health Center for 16 years before beginning a full-time private practice, where he worked with children, adolescents, families, and adults until his retirement in 2016. Dr. Kantor has brought descriptive psychology concepts to address a variety of political and historical issues, demonstrating how these concepts can be brought to bear on recent events. You can always be sure these concepts bring new perspectives on these important issues. And now I give you Dr. Charlie Kantor with Enemies of the People, Whistleblowers and the Status Dynamics of Community Critics.
Everybody can hear me? If you just raise your hand. Good. It's always a pleasure to follow Ray Bergner. I always appreciate everything he says. Ray, that was terrific. Let me start by sharing my screen. I'm going to be doing this pretty much the whole time, I think. And if everybody can tell me. Everybody see that? Enemies of the People, Whistleblowers, and the Status Dynamics of Community Critics. And we'll start with a quote. It is a splendid thing for a man to be able to feel that he has done a service to his native town and to his fellow citizens. Dr. Thomas Stockman in Ibsen, An Enemy of the People. Written in 1882, Ibsen's The Enemy of the People dramatized the struggle of a town of friends and of family members to come to terms with a startling revelation by Dr. Thomas Stockman. Stockman learns that the healing waters of their town depended on these waters to draw tourists for its financial survival are polluted. He vows to reveal the truth to the community to save the people from the poisoned waters. But the mayor of the town, the Honorable Peter Stockman, Thomas's brother, sees Thomas not as a welcome community critic working for the common good, but as someone seeking his own glory by selfishly failing to protect what sustains the town, the revenue from the baths. This clash is depicted in this clip from the 2012 Broadway revival of the play. And on the right, Boyd Gaines, you'll see, is playing the good doctor. And on the left, you'll see Richard Thomas, who plays his brother, the Honorable Mayor, Peter Stockman.
Oh, you never were very bright, Tom. You don't see the hole you've dug for yourself, do you?
I don't see any hole. Show me.
It's a gaping great hole. Big enough for you, your wife, your 3 children.
What do you say?
I've helped you, haven't I?
And I've been grateful.
I don't want your gratitude. It's been as much for my sake as yours. Do you think someone in my position can afford to be associated with scandal?
You think I'm scandalous?
You invite controversy.
I don't.
You do. You have to write and shout about every new complaint or idea that you have. You have to read about your own anger in the paper before you can truly feel it.
It's my duty to share what I feel with the public.
You always were a selfish bastard. Who gave you that job at the bath?
There wouldn't have been any bats if I hadn't seen that this was the perfect climate for a spa town. I pushed the idea for years. I wrote about it, pages of endless reports I wrote.
You weren't even resident here. We were here. We knew when the time was right for it.
And then you mucked it all up, you and your brilliant damned associates.
You're aching for a fight, aren't you? You never could take authority, could you? I have told you what's at stake, and I'm not about to compromise.
So what will you do?
Well, you've been stupid enough to... You're just going to have to retract the whole thing publicly.
What did you just say?
You're going to find that you've been mistaken.
Am I?
You will express your confidence in the committee and its commitment to ongoing improvements, which may be merely cosmetic.
You have to reroute the whole system, Peter!
As an employee, you haven't the right to tell me anything.
I haven't the right.
No, you work for me, Thomas. And you'll find in your contract that one of the rules is that you're not allowed to contradict your superior.
What? I'm a doctor. I'm a man of science. That's some creepy.
The world doesn't revolve around your science. It's about money.
A familiar argument we've heard recently. Denigrated by the town leadership as an enemy of the people, Dr. Stockman perseveres despite damage to his reputation, livelihood, and family. Like whistleblowers in the United States, Dr. Stockman, despite his moral intentions, faces humiliation and ruin. And like other persistent whistleblowers, He remains determined until the end as rocks from the people fly through his windows. Whistleblower movie heroes. Whistleblowers are popular heroes for our modern dramas. Films such as Serpico and Silkwood are based on iconic whistleblowers, modern-day Davids taking down the Goliaths of fraud, greed, and corruption. We root for these heroes. They are nearly paradigm cases of good versus evil. But in reality, whistleblowers almost always face resistance in the form of retaliation and degradation from the leadership they're exposing. Some studies have found that 90% of whistleblowers were demoted or lost their jobs, and 27% faced legal troubles, and just as many had psychiatric or medical issues following their decision to expose wrongdoing. Other studies found that 69% lost their jobs, and 60% and greater faced poor job performance evaluations, had their work micromanaged, and were shunned by fellow workers, and blacklisted from finding another job in their profession. For many in power, the whistleblower is not a hero, but a rat, a snitch, a traitor, someone to be dismissed. We will examine the status and community dynamics that create these contradictions. To accomplish this, I will present the concept of the critic in descriptive psychology and develop how this concept connects to how communities function. But before that, a quick history review to remind us of how whistleblowing has been a status in the United States from revolutionary times, and how the unwanted, intrusive, unwelcome community critic is fundamental to sustaining communities. In 1778, in response to Commodore Isaac Hopkins' abuse of prisoners of war, 10 sailors blew the whistle and prompted the following law: resolve that it is the duty of all persons in the service of the United States and of all other inhabitants thereof to give the earliest information to Congress or other proper authority of any misconduct, frauds, or misdemeanors committed by any officers or persons in the service of these states, which may come to their knowledge. This law was strengthened by Lincoln in 1863 under the name the False Claims Act, which, influenced by the fraud committed by persons outfitting Union soldiers, yes, with cardboard boots, established the principle of quitam, based on the following Latin saying: quitam pro domino rege quam pro se ipso in hoc parte sequitur, which means, quote, he who sues on behalf of our Lord the King and on his own behalf, further establishing the right of individual citizens in support of the Constitution to make claims upon the leaderships of organizations and institutions. The False Claims Act was strengthened in 1986, as well as in a variety of over 50 federal statutes since. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Utah has championed whistleblowers and noted that they are usually as welcome as a skunk at a picnic. Whistleblowers came along well before the American Republic, of course. Socrates' famous plea for his life as a gadfly of the Athenian people suggests the fundamental nature of the whistleblower status. Quote, I am a sort of gadfly given to the state by God, and the state is a great and noble steed, who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has attached to the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. From Plato, the Apology. Aware of other gadflies and heretics in history who defied the community, the founders in those revolutionary times built into the laws of the new United States protection for those citizens willing to challenge those in power, to honor their commitment to the common good. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson remarked in a letter to James Madison in 1787, quote, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. From Dr. Stockman to Dr. Lee. In the last 12 months, whistleblowers Dr. Rick Bright, Captain Brett Crozier, Dr. Lee Winliang faced similar patterns of rejection and degradation by being stinging gadflies of the state. Dr. Bright blew the whistle on the Trump administration's attempts to reify the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine and was demoted. Captain Brett Crozier complained publicly that the US Navy was failing to heed his warnings about his many sick sailors and was dismissed from his duties. And Wuhan's Dr. Li Wenliang was denounced for stinging the Chinese state with dire warnings about the COVID-19 pandemic. He later died from exposure to the virus. From Dr. Stockman to Dr. Lee, many undesignated, informal, unwelcome community regulators, whistleblowers, have sought to curb communities' representatives from ignoring and/or abusing the common good. But far from being lauded for their courage, these whistleblowers are not welcomed, and they're often excoriated by many in their communities. Oops. Just a bit of water. We will examine the concept of the critic and how this concept helps us understand the power and plight of the unwelcome community regulator and the whistleblower's status in communities. We will then look at the choices made in constraining reactions faced by 3 other whistleblowers in order to illustrate the pattern of these conflicts. The 3 are Ellen Backlund-Kuntz, who exposed fraud in a major healthcare group in Florida, Michael Winston, whose revelations led to the prosecution of executives of Countrywide Financial, and Catherine Gunn, whose whistleblowing could have stopped the Iraq War. We want to explain how, despite these whistleblowers making moral choices to preserve important communities in their lives and the lives of others, that these same communities rejected these community representatives and branded them enemies of the people. Most of us recognize this guy here. A couple of quick quotes that are going to come up in the next section. Quote, "For the appraiser or critic, the world is either satisfactory or unsatisfactory in a given respect." Pito Sorio, Behavior of Persons. "And judgments about what one of us would properly do can be wrong, and they will almost certainly become outdated at some time. And if they are, I can resist, I can go my own way." Also from Behavior of Persons. Regulating behavior, actor, observer, critic. Initially, a whistleblower is a critic of the leadership or command structure of some community, organization, or institution. Descriptive psychologists have conceptualized the critic in the following way. Pito Sorio described the critic as a status, that is, a position or a place that is conceptually connected to 2 other statuses, actor and observer. These 3 statuses, actor, observer, and critic, or AOC, describe the self-regulatory competence of persons. Comparing a status to a perspective or a job, Osorio describes the job of the actor is to behave spontaneously, to act on one's impulses, desires, and inclinations. The status observer involves noting 1, what is the case now, 2, what is happening now, 3, what has happened in the past, and what happens generally, and 4, what is the case generally, and 5, how things work. And Osorio goes on to describe the critic in the following way, quote, "As a critic, I first evaluate whether what is the case and what is happening now are satisfactory, making use of the observer information. If things are good enough or better than good enough, that judgment is available to the actor, and both critic and actor are free to enjoy that. But 2, if things are not good enough, as a critic, I formulate a diagnosis, that is an account of what is wrong, and a prescription or a specification of what to do differently to try to help matters. The prescription is the primary feedback to the actor. Note in the slide that the statuses of actor, observer, and critic are connected in a feedback loop, interrelated to demonstrate how persons self-regulate. And in general, we regulate in this way spontaneously. Osorio also discussed how persons acquire this competence to self-regulate. He offered the developmental schema in the slide above, a simple diagram which reminds us that all personal characteristics are acquired, quote, by having the prior capacity and the relevant intervening history, unquote. The developmental schema shows over time that our personal characteristics, or PCs, change owing to our capacity and learning history. At any moment in time, our behavior reflects our personal characteristics and our circumstances. But how about the observer critic of the observer critic? Or as has been said by Pete and especially by Sonia Holt, O2C2. Part of this learning history consists of other persons such as parents, teachers, and mentors acting as observer critics who teach the first person how to choose more successfully under particular circumstances. Our shorthand term for this second level mentoring, observer critic, is O2C2. This is a general schema for the development of judgment. The statuses of actor, observer, critic are involved in choosing how to act under varying circumstances. Choosing, that is, acting competently, involves distinguishing the relevant circumstances, knowing the relevant reasons, and weighing these reasons effectively. When a parent acts to improve the judgment of her child, she is doing so in the context of the circumstances, the situation that her child is in, per our discussion just now. The second level observer critic, or O2C2 status, articulated by Sonia Holt in 2006, describes what parents do to discipline and improve the judgment of their children. Holt showed how others in a community, organization, institution, or culture are eligible for this O2C2 status as well. Community parameters. Choosing is done within the context of some community, and whether the community is a play group, a bowling team, a job situation, a romantic relationship, a culture, and so forth. For descriptive psychologists, the concept of community is characterized by the following parameters: members, statuses, social practices, language, values, choice principles, and world. If you were here last night, you heard Trish talk about these very articulately. These parameters provide a context for any given situation and one's judgment. Members of a community share a common worldview, participate in common practices, and value certain choice principles as standards of judgment. Evaluating one's choices is done relative to the community and the parameters of the community. But persons paradigmatically belong to multiple communities as well. Let me emphasize that. We belong to multiple communities. Thus, while each person's world is unique, that is, the set of communities I belong to is unlikely to be just like the set of communities anyone else belongs to. Persons form, maintain, and change the communities within which they behave. In fact, a person, in order to behave at all, must do so relative to some set of facts, and these facts gain their significance based on the communities in which the person is behaving. Osorio reminds us of this via the following maxims. A person requires a community in order for it to be possible for him to engage in human behavior at all. A person requires that the community would be one way rather than another in order for him to behave in one way rather than another. A person's place in the community provides reasons and opportunities to engage in one behavior rather than another. If a person participates in a social practice, he must do it in one of the ways it can be done. If a person makes non-normative choices in his participation in the social practices of the community, that calls for an explanation. And a person may act as a representative of the community or as merely a member. Because the critic operates within some community, the standards he applies are community standards. In the sense that the critic's judgments apply these standards to the community, one might say, as Osorio stated, the critic speaks for us. The distinction is between the actor perspective, which is a personal framework for what applies to me, that is my behavioral possibilities, and the framework of the community standards of the critic. O2C2s, the observer critic of the observer critic, teachings occur in the context of particular social practices and communities. Likewise, distinguishing and weighing the circumstances is done within the context of communities. To the extent that we speak about a person learning to regulate oneself and learning judgment through the mentorship of various O2C2s, such as teachers, coaches, therapists, and others, we are then able to speak of a community of persons checking or regulating one another's behavior. A whistleblower begins as a critic, acting as a community representative and alerting the community to significant wrongdoing by some of its members. Welcome and unwelcome critics. But a whistleblower, usually just one voice, is not the sort of lone regulator we think of when we think of communities regulating its members' behavior. Osorio notes that generally many members of a community, the social us, serve as a check on an individual member's behavior, given the above notion, both from child development and the nature of O2C2s, checking the behavior of members in any particular community, large or small, formal or informal. But Osorio also emphasizes that this discrepancy between the individual's perspective and the community's view of what is the case can serve as a check in the other direction. Quote, the discrepancy means that each kind of judgment can serve as a reality check on the other. We are all familiar with the ways in which the social can serve as a corrective to the individual view. We are less familiar with the fact that it can and should work the other way as well. Quote, us, unquote, does not refer to an all-knowing, impeccable group soul, but rather to a group of individual me's. When I, in good faith, claim to speak for us, but in fact do not, that calls for some corrective. Quote, that doesn't speak to my condition, unquote, and God help me, I can do no other, are classic phrases used to indicate such a state of affairs. Judgments about one of us would properly do can be wrong, and they will almost certainly become outdated at some time. And if they are, I can resist, I can go my own way. I can resist, I can go my own way. A person regulates her own behavior and is a critic of her own behavior. Her standards for such evaluation and prescription for change, if necessary, is relative to the communities in which she has membership. Accordingly, she is applying community standards. She is observing, speaking, and acting for us. Therefore, any community member has at her disposal a possible community regulator status. Osorio goes on to state, quote, what the members of a community are committed to by virtue of, and often as a condition of being members, is the major basis for one member having claims and making claims upon other members, unquote. A community member acting as a community representative and making claims upon other members is acting as an O2C2, observer critic of the community. The paradigm case O2C2 represents the community, has the community's best interest in mind, and evaluates, prescribes, and acts to sustain the community. But in organizations, institutions, and cultures, as Osorio notes strongly above, a member may become aware of a mismatch between how he sees a practice being carried out and what he believes is the proper or ethical way to carry out this practice. Even though he can make this judgment, as a result, has reason to alter his own behavior and call for change in the behavior of others in the community, he, the critic, may be unwanted. Who asked you anyway? And undesignated to do so in the offending community. You have no standing here, and your opinion has no bearing on this matter. Note Mayor Stockman's attempts to set his brother straight in the first clip. A status conflict prevails between the community member's self-assigned status and his eligibility according to the community's leadership command structure to act as an O2C2. In many communities, these community regulators are informal. In a marriage, a friendship, the Friday lunch group, or the Monday golf group, how the group regulates is not dictated by formalized policies and procedures. But organizations and institutions have formalized authority, chain of command structures, which include overseeing operations, determining problematic situations, and prescribing and carrying out changes for the better of the organization, paradigmatically. Large numbers of people working toward a particular mission require coordinated approaches to guide the organization towards its goals set forth in the mission. See much of Tony Putman's work. But regardless of the organizational structure, the members of such large and formalized communities are all eligible critics and are likely to criticize not only their own behavior with respect to the organization, but others' behavior as well. The fact that every member of an organization has a particular perspective creates variability in points of view that gives the community greater potential to deal with unforeseen circumstances. Descriptive psychologists Tony Putman, Ray Bergner, C.J. Peek, and Richard Heinrich have contributed over the years to our literature on leadership in communities and organizations. Their scholarships helps us understand the importance of not only competent leaders who recognize the value of monitoring the practices of their organizations, but leaders who recognize the multiple perspectives that individual members bring to the community's success. They emphasize a leader's ability to balance these diversities of opinion with the ongoing order of getting the job done. These approaches welcome each member's status as a community critic and note the necessity for acknowledging and valuing those perspectives. In their model, a member challenging the status quo would be welcomed as valuable for the maintenance and sustenance of the organization. Like genetic variability in a biological population, this perspective variability increases the behavior potential of any community to handle unforeseen circumstances. On the other hand, if everyone has equal authority to critique, offer changes, and carry out changes, one could expect a disorderly organization. Successful organizations balance welcoming all manner of critique from employees with leadership trusted to maintain orderly practices to get the job done. Whereas such critiques are not infrequently heard in informal discussions at the water cooler, at lunch, and so forth, organizational members only sometimes make formal complaints. Whether this sort of complaint is treated as a potential advantage for a corporation or as an attack on the orderly workings of the firm depends on many factors, not the least of which is the intention of the critic, the valuing of criticism by management, and what in fact the critique alleges. Disgruntlement over the fact that the Friday pastries are consistently stale is treated quite differently than an accusation that management is participating in systematic fraud. It's the whistleblower who sees this fraud or some like transgression and acts on behalf of the community to correct the transgression. The whistleblower, from O2C2 to denouncer. And just to give you a quick preview of the next section, given this analysis of self and community regulation and the relationship of the critic to the function of communities, we will now look at the following set of scenarios involving a community member acting as a whistleblower. 1, the inside community critic, community regulator notes actions or practices by management that violate the core standards of the community. 2, formal organizational management rejects, ignores, undermines the complaint made by the inside community critic. Number 3, the whistleblower dilemma. Number 4, from O2C2 to denouncer. Number 3, degradation begets degradation. And number 5, and number 6, appeal to the judiciary. The observer critic sees wrongdoing. When a critic, typically in an organization, let's start again. When a critic, typically inside an organization, notes actions or practices by management that violate the core standards, practice, values, regulations, or mission of that organization or community, then the critic typically, where possible, brings this to the attention of management within the power structure to correct. It could also be that an action by management is failing to monitor, correct, and uphold the shared organizational and community standards. In the following illustration, our 3 whistleblowers describe their experience in these initial events. Ellen Backlund-Kuntz. Although head of compliance ethics in the Halifax hospital system in Florida, Backlund-Kuntz found herself swimming against the tide when she alerted those in charge of regulating hospital practices that unprovided services were being billed to Medicare. Backlund-Kuntz describes her Halifax relationships there in the following way, unquote. Halifax was like a family for me. All of my friends were there, and I really looked up to some of my bosses. I was incredibly proud of that hospital and the work we did in the community, unquote. She begins to notice patterns suggesting that the hospital is billing patients, other insurance carriers, and Medicare for services that are not actually performed. Backlund-Kuntz alerts high-level hospital managers of her concerns, but gets little or no feedback. She becomes more educated in compliance issues in order to burnish her credentials in hopes of getting a response from the upper echelon officials. Michael Winston, a top executive on Wall Street. Winston believes he was hired by Countrywide Financial to professionalize its operations. He discovers that loans are written with no collateral and little oversight as to the promise of repayment. Soon after becoming employed at Countrywide, Winston notices this license plate in the parking lot, quote, "Fundum," unquote. He soon recognizes that this is in fact a policy of the mortgage lending company, fund anyone. Wilson raises issues that the company's practices are already hurting their ratings with stock rating agencies. Countrywide's practices contribute significantly to the Great Recession of 2008. In 2003, the United States and Great Britain are pressing the UN Security Council to authorize war against Iraq. There are large anti-war protests in the streets of London. Catherine Gunn, a translator at her desk in the General Communication Headquarters of British Intelligence, known as the GCHQ, and this is equivalent to the NSA, reads an email from the NSA, the United States, asking agents to research and gather information on 6 ambassadors to the United Nations, representatives of the rotating countries on the Security Council. Gunn recognizes an attempt at blackmailing these ambassadors into voting for war and decides to copy the email.
Solomon's book. And I educated myself. And I came to the conclusion that Iraq was not a threat. So in, as Norman had said, in January 2003, when this email crossed my computer screen, and by the way, over 100 people at GCHQ received that same email. Yeah, it was almost instantaneous, my response. Now, I came up with an analogy this morning because I was trying to describe how immediate that kind of reaction was. If any one of us saw an elderly person struggling along the street and somebody came up and tried to grab their handbag or rob them, or if any of us saw a child kind of unknowingly wander into the middle of a busy road, our instinctual reaction would be to intervene, I think. And that's the level of my reaction when I saw the email was, this is going to be a disaster.
The whistleblower dilemma. However, if the critic, whether inside or outside the organization's power structure, finds himself or herself unable to effect correction of the violated core practices and standards, the dilemma arises of what to do and what action or behavioral possibilities are available to the critic. This dilemma generally entails the whistleblower being in a strong status conflict. See a lot of Tony Putman's works. On the one hand, the whistleblower has been a loyal community member upholding the standards of the community. On the other, she realizes that her going outside the community will be an attack on the community, albeit one for strong moral reasons, ultimately one for the common good of the grassroots community members themselves, as well as for the greater community of which the organization or institution is a part. The change is from a loyal member trying to improve the workings of the community to an accuser, recognizing that change can only come via a wholesale change in the command structure of the community. I never wanted to become a whistleblower, Backlund says. I gave the information to so many people in compliance, in legal, because I thought they'd have something to do with it once they knew. I never imagined that people in their positions could just walk away. She begins to suffer from stomach difficulties the more she registers her complaints and the more these are not acted upon. I remember standing in front of that group and telling them how proud Halifax was that we'd had a compliance program since 1998. And we do this so that we don't become the Enron of Daytona Beach. And once I learned what was going on, I felt that I had 2 personalities. I felt like I was getting up there lying to these people because we weren't doing any of the things our policy said we would. That's when I learned that I learned all this. When I learned all this, I went to my boss and I said, I can't do this anymore. But he told me that my loyalty was to Halifax, not to the government. Our goal was to protect Halifax. Despite strong loyalty to Halifax under concern for her fellow workers. Backwood knows she must choose. I'm probably going to lose my job, she told her husband. We may lose our house, but I cannot do this anymore. I just know it's the right thing to do. She decides at this point to go outside the company with her complaints and hires a lawyer specializing in whistleblower issues. Her husband supports her decision to take further action. Michael Winston's warnings to the company executives are dismissed, and he is told to play ball or else. Winston looked at his boss and said, quote, "I know what you want me to do, but I'm not your guy," unquote, when he was actually asked to go lie to the ratings agency Moody about the situation, the financial situation of Countrywide Financial. Winston, like Backwood, struggles with conflicting statuses. His place as a loyal team player, and his place as a professional to improve the organization. Quote, "It can seem hard to keep your mind when everyone else is losing theirs. But as long as you know your own mind and know what's right, it's not hard at all. You should be reminded of, quote, judgments about one of us would properly do can be wrong, and they will almost certainly become outdated at some time. And if they are, I can resist. I can go my own way." Winston cites the following as a tipping point that results in his final status assignment to go outside compliance agencies with regard to the behavior of Countrywide executives. The tipping point had to do with health concerns in the building in which Winston was the highest ranking executive. Winston became alarmed by a caustic smell and health complaints by his employees. People complained of headaches, stomach aches, shortness of breath, dizziness, and metallic taste in their mouths. One colleague, due to give birth in 5 weeks, wrote to Winston and said she feared coming to work. Winston says, quote, "And right after I read that letter, I spoke to the head of facilities and asked him, what's the status of the mitigation efforts? He said, there's no status. We consider this a one-off incident. The case is closed." And Winston says, "That's what prompted me to call OSHA." Gunn decides to forego alerting an internal compliance employee as she fears the UN vote is imminent. She also believes that her concerns will be dismissed and that her superiors will be eyeing her very closely after that. She believes she needs to go to an outside O2C2 as soon as possible. She passes the email on to someone who then passes it on to the press in a way that protects Gunn's identity. But she is troubled knowing she has broken the law and terrified she will be found out. She violates the Official Secrets Act, but fears another war will cost many British and Iraqi lives. Gunn suffers with depression for 2 years following the resolution of her actions. She struggles with fear that she will be found out before she confesses. She is unable to pretend that she is innocent and carry on as usual. Gunn has already assigned the status of war resister to herself, and the email provides an opportunity to act on that status. When the email is published, she recalls being stunned, being unable to move in the supermarket in which she first saw the headline in the published email. She decides to confess because she cannot lead a double life and because she experiences significant guilt for violating the law. But she also sees herself as not working for the British government, but for the British people. A status assignment dramatized with this moment in the film entitled Official Secrets. This is right after Catherine Gunn, played by Keira Knightley in the film, is arrested and she's being interrogated.
Your supervisor speaks highly of your integrity. She says this breach was a foolish one-off. Was it?
Do you mean if I leaked anything else? No.
Do you intend to?
No. I've always been very proud to work at GCHQ.
Until now.
Yes, until now.
What were you employed to do?
I can't be specific.
Be general then.
I translated signals intelligence and I reported anything I thought might be of interest to my clients.
Your clients?
The Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence.
So, you work for the British government?
No, not really.
No?
Governments change. I work for the British people. I gather intelligence so that the government can protect the British people. I do not gather intelligence so that the government can lie to the British people.
She will not be complicit in lying to the British people. Her standing is anchored not with the government, but with the British people. The accusation. Whistleblowing is the choice of exposing the wrongdoing by going outside the authority command structure chain of command. The whistleblower is in effect going to a third party, appealing to this other superior authority and making an accusation. The critic is accusing the command structure of failure to carry out core practices of the organization by failing to monitor and correct actions within the organization critical to the sustenance of the organization or which violate community standards. To the extent that this accusation is not only of leadership's oversight failure, but of its violating these standards intentionally, willfully, the criticism is all the more stronger and is an indictment of the moral standards, the character of those in authority. Such an accusation carries with it the force of a denunciation of those in charge, not merely a mistake or a minor error in judgment. The whistleblower's degradation ceremony. To understand the full significance and repercussions of this sort of criticism and why it is viewed as an attack that threatens management at its core, let's recall the features of a degradation ceremony by Garfinkel and of course used many times by Pete Osorio, often cited in descriptive psychology. In the whistleblower's degradation of the command structure of an organization, we can specify certain statuses. 1, we have the wrongdoer, the perpetrator who's being called out, management. 2, we have the critic, whistleblower, the person pointing out or denouncing the wrongdoing, the critic as denouncer. And 3, and we have the third party to whom the complaint of wrongdoing is made, the witness or witnesses who are appealed to and who, like the denouncer, represent the greater community standards that are being violated. Number 4, both the denouncer, the whistleblower critic, and those appealed to outside the organization's command structure must be representatives of the community and acting in the interest of the community rather than for themselves. And 5, the wrongdoing is shown to be a genuine reflection of the perpetrator's character. Otherwise, management would have already corrected the problem, but chose not to. Thus, the accusation itself places the perpetrator wrongdoer management in a position of losing status, being degraded, unless they are able to successfully defend against the accusation. This analysis takes us further to understanding the dynamic set into play by a whistleblower. It's not merely that the whistleblower attacks, so management attacks back by defending and retaliating like kids on a playground. What's at issue is that the whistleblower has called into issue the offending organization's leadership and the organization's good standing in the community. The whistleblower is a threat to the power structure that must be eliminated or neutralized or defended against, or however you SWAT and eliminate gadflies so they don't disrupt business as usual. Degradation begets degradation. And one of my favorite quotes from The Wire, if you're familiar with the great TV series The Wire, if you come at the king, you best not miss. And degradation begets degradation. This derives from the maxims 1, that a person will not choose less behavior potential over more if given the choice, and 2, provocation elicits hostility. Because the whistleblower is a self-assigned denouncer representing the community whose interests are being violated, the command structure is not merely threatened by an unwelcome O2C2 community regulator trying to improve things, but a denouncer undercutting the very status structure of the organization to reduce the behavior potential of those accused. This generates strong reasons for the managers to see these actions as a provocation, as a real threat to their organizational behavior potential, and to denigrate and invalidate the denouncer. These are the circumstances under which the whistleblower faces significant degrading actions by management. The critic who is faced with the dilemma of blowing the whistle by acting outside the failed chain of command is faced with the prospect of not only inciting the ire of those in command power, but disrupting the entire power structure, which supports these decision makers. This includes the allies of those decision makers throughout the organization and those other communities, organizations, and institutions who depend on that organization to keep operating as it has been. The hospital denigrates Backlund Kuntz as motivated purely by greed, as a predator attempting to attack the Halifax community, to be an enemy of the community. She is shunned at meetings. Her performance evaluations, which were uniformly stellar, suddenly plunge. She receives zeros in leadership. She is moved to a small, unpaid office at the end of a long hallway. After the suit is completed, Backlund Kuntz is unable to find a job in healthcare. One interviewer confesses to her, after trying to recommend Elin for a particular position, that the board, and particularly the firm's general counsel, had objected to hiring a whistleblower. Quote, "The concern is how our larger clients will handle knowing that we're employing a whistleblower and that they could drop us as a client," unquote. Countrywide retaliates against Winston's insistence on doing the right thing by cutting his team from 200 to 2 staff members. His $14 million budget is cut to 0. His bonus is eliminated. He suspects his phones are tapped, among other fearful intrusions into his family. Gunn is prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act as betraying the people, as an enemy of the people. If convicted, she faces 2 years in jail. Once charges are brought against Gunn, she is not allowed to continue to work. In addition, her husband, a Turkish Kurd, is threatened with deportation as she awaits trial. Whistleblowers in the judiciary. Once the whistleblower has denounced the community leadership to the greater community, the matter will tend to fall to a commonly acknowledged status assigner. The judicial institutions to determine whether the accusations have merit and whether the leadership will face actual degradation. But life for our heroic whistleblowers usually remains a struggle. Although Backlund Kuntz wins her suit with Halifax and Halifax admits to wrongdoing, she worries that many patients harmed and the families of those patients killed by Halifax's actions will not receive justice. Winston is successful getting verdicts in his favor, but extensive post-verdict legal maneuvering leads to difficulty in collecting his reward. Many studies suggest bias in the judgments of appeals justices against plaintiffs and tendencies to back or overturn verdicts. A whistleblower, to be ultimately successful, must pursue justice for years as a rule. Gunn's legal team subpoenas as much information as possible from the government. Her lawyers, believing at some point that the government itself debated the legality of the war, near the trial date, the government drops all charges. Speculation is that the government wanted to protect the possibility of the details of this debate becoming public. Regardless of her avoiding jail, the Iraq War cost the lives of an estimated 600,000 Iraqis, in addition to the loss of many soldiers on all sides. Conclusion. Understanding the quest of persons becoming whistleblowers examines the perspectives and status of community critics, those unwelcome skunks at leadership's picnics. When a community's O2C2 statuses are corrupted, if the designated O2C2 practices fail to correct the violation of core practices, fertile ground exists for whistleblower to emerge. Osorio's articulation of the critic gives us insight into why this is the case. Since each person develops a critic status from early development, and since such a status is critical to a person behaving properly, effectively, competently, everyone is a critic. And since each person's status as a critic is based on community standards, each person has eligibility to make claims upon other community members. These regulators, observer critics, O2C2s, take a further step as whistleblowers to come forward to expose wrongdoing, corruption, fraud, dangerous conduct, and the like. The transgressions by command structures of their own organizations' standards or those of the greater community. Whistleblowers paradigmatically are acting on behalf of the organization's, institutions, or greater community's common good by appealing outside the chain of command to correct violations of community standards. Ultimately, whistleblowers denounce this command structure when they face intentional impasses to their attempts to improve the practices of the community. Many times the whistleblower is already working as in an O2C2 status within the community and is therefore sensitized to the various patterns that she recognizes as problematic. Both Winston and Backlund Kuntz had such positions and saw their coming forth as part of what should have been expected by upper management. Gunn saw herself as a representative of the British people, ultimately a protector of the British people. Whistleblowers are loyal to the common good and nearly always pay a heavy personal price to preserve that. But these unwelcome critics are indispensable to sustaining and enhancing communities. And we'll end by giving Catherine Gunn the last word.
Do you feel an affinity with all these different forms of whistleblowing?
Obviously, I feel that, they've gone through a lot and many of them suffered a great deal more than I did. I think the real question should be, is the system working properly? I mean, we have a lot of honorable men and women, I've since come to realize and have been contacted by people who have said that they have worked in institutions where they've signed the Official Secrets Act and they have seen things that they wish they had brought to the public notice. However, they always chose family and career before releasing the information. And why is that? The reason they don't want to bring the forward information is perfectly understandable because they fear the Official Secrets Act. It's so draconian, there is no defense, which basically means anybody who has signed the Official Secrets Act cannot, should not, ever speak anything about anything they see. And that's an absurd situation in a liberal democracy.
Catherine.
I want to thank everybody for listening. Before we get into questions, let me first thank the Boston Study Group that we were talking about whistleblowers months and months ago and came up with some of the early formulations, but especially Jane Lippman, who has spent hours with me working on this. And of course, Nancy, who's had to tolerate my irritability for the last 10 months or something like that to do this. But I threw some other ideas on here that I had been thinking about, as well as let's have some comments and questions. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Very nice.